Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. Welcome back. We are all healthy again, Baruch Hashem. And after a brief hiatus, we're back. So I believe we finished off the second parak. Is that correct? Somebody was paying attention. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Good. So we finished the second parak of Masechet Beitzah. So we begin, surprisingly, the third parak this morning. They were on Daf Kaf Gimel Amud Bet at the bottom. Okay, very exciting. New parak, we're about halfway through the Masechet, maybe more than halfway. So this Masechet deals with, at least the first couple of Mishnayot, deal with the Melacha of Tzeidah, the Melacha of trapping. Okay, it's not going to be such a relevant halacha for us nowadays, although there are two Melachot Tzeidah, trapping and Shechita, which is slaughtering, which do come up potentially, is a question that's asked, on Yom Tov, are you allowed to, if you have mosquitoes or pests or other things like that, would you be allowed to kill a mosquito on Yom Tov? Right? Because the melacha of shechita, why can you not kill it on Shabbat? Because it's part of the melacha of shechita, even though you're not eating it. But the Gemara says that netilat neshama and shechita are the same melacha. Of course, not for an ochel nefesh purpose, it's for different. So that's a fascinating question that comes up. But that's right. But that's right to the melacha of shechita. But yeah, we're dealing with the melacha of tzeidah, of trapping. So you would say, if you didn't know anything, and we're coming at this with a blank slate, we'd say, well, we know that melechet ochel nefesh is allowed on Shabbat. Trapping would seemingly be part of melechet ochel nefesh, right? First you trap the animal, then you kill the animal, then you salt it, etc. However, that's not the case. We're going to find that tzeidah, we assume, is not acceptable on Yom Tov. We're going to have to understand why. And that, of course, is going to be subject to dispute amongst the Rishonim. So let's have a look. Our Mishnah says like this. It says, Ein Sadim, Mishnah dives right in to the parameters of what is forbidden trapping on Yom Tov and what is permitted trapping on Yom Tov. And our understanding is what is permitted trapping, in other words, is not trapping. That's not in the parameters of the Melacha. This is probably going to be the same for Shabbat and Yom Tov because we don't have the leniency of ochel nefesh when it comes to Melacha of Seder. So says the Mishnah, Ein sadin dagim min habivarim b'Yom Tov. We cannot, now, it gets a little bit confusing when we talk about sadin mi versus sadin le. We'll just explain, right? Where the Mishnah says, Ein sadin dagim min habivarim. Bivarim is a type of enclosure. Okay, now it's not going to be a uniform size. There's different types of enclosures you can have for different animals. It can be different sizes, as we'll see. And the enclosure for one animal may not be the same as the enclosure for another animal. So the two questions which are going to be, one is, can I trap the animal into the enclosure in the first place? And the second question is, can I trap the animal from the enclosure? So it would work like this. If we say that the animal inside the enclosure is not trapped, so that would mean that having the animal inside, getting the animal into the enclosure is no problem because it's still not trapped. However, to trap the animal from the enclosure, that would be forbidden because the animal's not trapped, and now I'm trapping it. On the other hand, if I was to say that actually having the animal inside the enclosure, right, that would not be permitted because that's the melacha. It's now, once it's placed inside this enclosure, I consider a trap. So then I can take it out from that enclosure because it's already been trapped and I'm not trapping it now. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing. Go study min habivarim or study le bivarim. It's in the Mishnah and the Gemara. But that's what we mean. So the Mishnah says, in other words, if you have these fish inside this bivar, in this enclosure, they are not considered trapped. So if I go, because they can still get away, that's the point. They can still get away from me. So if I go and try to trap them, that's forbidden. Okay, side issue. But another halacha is that we cannot place food in front of them. We cannot place food in front of them. We're going to see that's either got to do with muktzah, or it's got to do with the fact that this is a tircha yatera. This is an extra tircha on Yom Tov that is forbidden. Aval tzadin chayav off min habivarin v'notnin mifneim mezonot. However, when it comes to chayav off, when it comes to larger animals and birds, those you can, according to Tanakama, those you can trap from the bivarin. In other words, if I have the fish inside the enclosure, they're still not considered trapped. I can't go and get them because they could still get away from me. However, animals and birds inside the enclosure, I can go and trap them because that's not actually trapping because they're already considered trapped, that I can easily access them. Then I can place food in front of them. Rashba Gomer Lo kol habivarin shavin. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says no. Says you're using this generic word bivarin. It depends. How big is it? How small is it? They aren't all going to be the same. And I'm going to give you a principle. So you no. He says zeh haklal. Kol hamechusar tzeda asur, v'she'eino mechusar tzeda mutar. Okay, that sounds very logical. Rabban Gamliel says anything that is mechusar tzeda, in other words, any animal, creature that is not trapped, if I go and trap it, that's going to be forbidden, and vice versa. Okay, it goes by what whether I have easy access to the animal or not. And we'll see in the Gemara, is Rashbag arguing with Tanakama? Is Rashbag explaining Tanakama? Okay, that's not completely clear. So let's see Rashi on the Mishnah. Okay, so Rashi says, Ein tzadin dagin min avirin, ein tzadin dagin. He says, Afal gab de shchita ve'afiya ubishul me'avot melachoten v'otshur letzorach yom tov. Right? What, in other words, Rashi is saying, why are we all of a sudden coming along and saying that you cannot perform the melacha of trapping? He says we have shchita, right? And this is, by the way, this is nowadays. This is one of the changes. Although Medina de Gemara, shchita is allowed on Yom Tov, nowadays, practically speaking, we don't do this. Rav Zevin has an article on this in Amadim Balacha. He goes through Yom Tov and he goes through the different melachot and he explains why this would no longer apply. But Medina de Gemara, shchita is allowed. So shchita, afiyan, bishul, right? Afiyan, bishul are really the same av melacha, but nonetheless, Rashi lists them separately. So he says shchita, afiyan, bishul, cooking, baking. These are all avot melachot. And they are allowed on Yom Tov. There's no issur to cook on Yom Tov, no issur of shchita. So he says, right, the implicit question is, Rashi doesn't spell it out, but the implicit question is, why do I have some avot melachot that are allowed for ochel nefesh, and I have some avot melachot that are forbidden for ochel nefesh, like say that. So he makes a distinction here, which a number of the Rishonim make this distinction. Tama mishum the efshar me'erev Yom Tov. Because you cannot do it on Erev Yom Tov, right? The shchita, if you do the shchita earlier before Yom Tov, so we're worried the flesh is going to start rotting. Right? Nowadays we have fridges, so it's not a problem. But if you can't do it before Yom Tov, therefore you're allowed to Yom Tov. What about cooking? We've discussed this before, so if you're listening, right? What about cooking? You'll say nowadays, but you can cook everything before Yom Tov, and the fact is, most people do cook before Yom Tov. Okay, you can put it all in the fridge. So the poskim writes, no. With cooking, everybody knows that a freshly cooked piece of food is better than food that you've taken out of the freezer and heated up, right? So therefore, although technically you could cook before Yom Tov nowadays, but intrinsically you can't get the same effect by doing it before. Therefore, you're still allowed to cook in Yom Tov. If there is a food which, by definition, gets better, right, when it's been cooked in advance, so then there would be a question whether you can cook that on Yom Tov as well. Okay, but so that's what Rashi says. He says anything you could do before Yom Tov, you don't have the leniency to do it on Yom Tov itself, and that's what Seidah. There's no issue to do it beforehand. He says about Seidah. If Shalat Sudom Ibod Yom, Venichem Tzura Tov B'Mayim. Okay, if we're talking about fish, okay, you can trap the fish before Yom Tov and you can leave them in the bucket in water or whatever. It won't die the next day. You can go and you can take it out. So that's what Rashi understands, right? Our Mishnah, and again, there are a number of different places. This is one example of it. We've mentioned it again and again throughout the Masechet. Our principle is that our Mishnah spells out for us that Amen Shabbat Yom Tov and Ochel Nefesh Bilvad. That Melachot Ochel Nefesh are allowed. But we find numerous examples of Melachot Ochel Nefesh that are not allowed. Now, the Gemara doesn't anywhere go and say, this is the principle, this is why you can, and this is where you can't. Gemara doesn't say that. So the Rishonim are left to try and figure it out. So this is one of the explanations. We've spoken before. There are those that are Ramban, for example, makes a distinction between the melachot that are done in the house and the melachot that are done in the field, in terms of cooking, in terms of what is allowed and what isn't allowed on Yom Tov. But here Rashi makes a distinction. He says any melacha for ochel nefesh that you could have performed intrinsically before Yom Tov, you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. Anything which you have to do on Yom Tov itself, that would be allowed. And therefore, Tzeidah is not allowed. Now have a look at Tosfot. Tosfot, of course, argues over here with Rashi. Tosfot, the first Tosfot of the paragraph, says, Ein sadin dagim and abibolim v'chulei. He says, Piresh Rashi, De'af agav de'ochel nefesh mutar, haynu dafka gagon bishul v'asiyah v'shchita, de'i efshar me'elev Yom Tov, de'yoter tov pat chama, וגם בישול ביום טוב, okay, Okay, so he quotes Rashi, and I don't know if he had a different gear, so he's just adding in. He says, Rashi says that Ochel Nefesh is allowed, like Bishul Afiyan Shchita, because you can't do it from Yom Tov, right? Yoter Tov Pat Chama. V'gam Bishul, the food that's been cooked on Yom Tov is going to be better than that which was prepared in advance. V'gam Bishul, the Shchita, Shema Yasreach. So too with Shchita, we're worried that the corpse is going to rot. Aval Seidah, if Shal Atzadom Erav Yom Tov, that's exactly what Rashi said. He says when it comes to Tzeidah, you could do it in advance. Says Tosfot I don't think so. I don't think that's correct. We said at the beginning of the as Tosfot himself explained at the beginning of the Masechet, Gabek Zera Shema Yitlosh, En Lachalek Ben Ochel Nefesh. Okay, he says when it comes to this chalukah of Efshar and Efshar, you're right, we have found in the Gemara, we do find in the Gemara a distinction between things you can do on Yom Tov and things you can do before Yom Tov versus things you can only do on Yom Tov. But that distinction is said not in the context of Ochel Nefesh, that distinction is made in the context of Machshirei Ochel Nefesh, meaning those activities which are preparing for the Ochel Nefesh. It's one step further removed. There we find that distinction, but we don't find distinction by Ochel Nefesh itself, and therefore Tosfos does not accept it. It says, and therefore he says, Nereli kepirush rach mikinon shepiresh leel mishum dedami liktsira. Okay, interesting. He says that earlier in the Masechet as well. He says that when it comes to Tzeidah is similar to harvesting. When you harvest, you pluck off the crops or the fruit from the tree. He says trapping an animal would be similar to that. Okay, and therefore it would be, and therefore that's why it would be forbidden. We can discuss. Does that mean that sounds like would only be in Isur D'Rabbanan? Big question here. When you say in Sadid, is in Isur D'Oraita or in Isur D'Rabbanan? Okay, but that's Rashi and Tosfos. So let's go back to Rashi now. Rashi next to Matris is Bivarim. What are these Bivarim? It says Shaldagim, Hen Brechot Shamayim Shekrin Vibel, Bivelin Shalchaya, Kalpifot Mukafin Gader, Saviv, V'kotzino Tochan Chayot Abar. Okay, so he's just explaining Bival is a generic word that means for an animal enclosure. So for fish, it means these are pools of water, right? We have the fish inside. When it comes to chaya, these are kalpifot mukafin gader. It's a big area, or maybe not so big, but it's an area that is enclosed with a gate, a fence around it. The konsina tochan chayot abar, you keep wild animals inside. That's where they have their offspring, and that's where they raise them, etc. Okay. The einotnin, we said einonin mezonot. We said einonin lifnei mezonot, right? We don't place before them. Lifnei adagim mezonot. We don't place food in front of the fish. Now you remember earlier on in the Masechet we had a machloket as to whether you're allowed to cook and whether you're allowed to make food for animals on Yom Tov or not, whether that's part of the allowance of Ochel Nefesh. So even the one who says that you're allowed to make food for animals would agree over here that you can't feed these fish. Why? He says, meaning when you have an animal that you are responsible for and that you have to feed, so that's one thing. However, the fish are not dependent on the fact that you'll give them food. They can eat roots, they can eat herbs, plants, whatever that are in the water. And the big fish eat the small fish. Okay, so they'll manage without you, and therefore you can't feed them because it's going to be an extra tircha on Yom Tov. Aval tzadin chayav off, says Rashi. So if I have what our Mishnah said as follows. It said if you have the fish in the enclosure, you can't trap them from within the enclosure. Okay, we assume they can still get around, they're still free. But it comes to chayav off, comes to the other animals that are those you can take out of the enclosure. Meaning, I understand that those animals are in the bivar; they're already considered trapped. So says Rashi, they're there from yesterday, i.e. from before Yom Tov. So kasal gadatach. This is what we understand at this point. It's kasal gadatach, meaning the Gemara may change our understanding. But kasal gadatach right now, hashta kevan demukafin gadel havulo kenitzodin v'omdin. So we understand We assume that since these animals and these birds are inside this enclosure, they're surrounded by a gate, so they are considered as if they are trapped. Aval dagin, nishmatin lacholin v'stakin, but the fish can go to different holes in different areas in the water where they can go and they can escape, and therefore they're not considered trapped. Right, these animals, they are dependent on you because they're in this closed off area. In winter, there's no food for them, and even in summer, there's food if people walk through and trample over the grass and over the plants, etc., which they would eat. And then over the page, right, Rashbag said, he said that means shetzarich letzudo. Okay, so that's our Mishnah. So our Mishnah said, "Ein sadin dagim min bivarim, aval sadin chayav ve'of." Okay, so we understand that in these enclosures, the fish are not yet considered trapped; they can still get away, but the animals are considered trapped, and therefore there's no issue to trap them further, so to speak, because they already are. So now says the Gemara. Now we're at the top of Daf Kaf Daled Amud Aleph. Uraminu, we have a contradiction. Okay, we have a brayta that says as follows. Bivalid shal chayav v'shalafot, en sadin mehem b'yom tov, ve'en onim lifnehem mezonot. Right, so if you have a chayav or an off inside one of these enclosures, I cannot trap it from there. So, and according to our Mishnah, we said you can trap the animal. The animal's already considered trapped once it's in the bivar. According to the brayta, it says no, it's still considered that it can get away, and if I would take it out from there, that's considered that I'm trapping. It's a put on Yom Tov. So it's a complete contradiction between the Mishnah and the brayta. Right? That's why we said Raminu, bivarin shachayav ofot, ein sadimim Yom Tov, ein onin lifnehem mezonot. So kasha chaya, kasha ofot. Okay, so we have two contradictions here: one regarding the chaya, and also regarding the ofot, regarding the birds. So says the Gemara now like this: Bishlama chaya lo kasha. We can resolve at least regarding the animals as follows: Ha Rabbi Yehuda, Ha Rabbana. We can say, okay, it's two different opinions. The opinion of our Mishnah is not the opinion of our Gemara. One is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, right? That's the brayta we've just seen is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and our Mishnah was Rabbanan. How do I know what's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? Ditnan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, this is the Mishnah in Shabbos. Right? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, atzad tzipor lamigdal v'tzvi labayit chayav. Labayit yodim chayev, aval lebivarin lo. Okay, we'll get to Chachamim in a moment. Again, this is where it gets confusing. That's why I said before, we talk about sadin la bibarin with sadin meha bibarin. Remember, in our Mishnah, until now, we've been talking about sadin meha bibarin. So what does Rabbi Yehuda say? So Rabbi Yehuda says as follows. He says, if you trap a bird into a tower, so a migdal is really sort of a cupboard. Right, Rashi says, yeah, tzad tzipor minachutz, from outside, you brought it into this wooden cupboard, tower, whatever, shekolin mishtael, or tzad tzvi minachutz, or you trapped a deer that was outside, and you brought it into the house, right? So he says, in such a case, that would be chayav. Hatzat tzipor lamigdal utzvi labayit chayav. So now the Gemara says, so here's the proof. Labayit hu demechayev, aval lebivarin lo. Meaning, if I brought this into the house, that would be chayav. But that's only in the house. A bivar, this enclosure, the understanding is that's much larger than the house or the room that you trapped it in. The implication is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if I would trap it into this enclosure, I would not be chayav. Meaning, therefore, meaning if I'm not chayav when I trap it into the bivar, that means if I would now come and try and take the animal from the bivar, from the enclosure, then I would be chayav, because that would be trapping. Right? So that is exactly what our brayta said. That's the opposite of our Mishnah. Again, our Mishnah said you cannot. Our Mishnah said what? It said you cannot trap the fish, but aval sadin chayav of min bivarim. You can take it out of the bivar, and that would imply that if you were to put it into the bivar in the first place, that would be trapping. That you would be chayav. But that's exactly what Rabbi Yehuda says. You'd not be chayav. That would be okay. Everybody good? It's a little bit confusing, but okay. So let's see. Just Rashi over there says. Rashi says chayav. Says kevad dechnis sipor lamigdal v'na'al lefanav harei machuz v'omed v'nigmar tzedato. Right. It says once you've brought this bird into this migdal and you've then closed it and locked it up, so then the bird is now considered inside. It's standing and it's trapped. V'chen tzvi labayit. Same thing. If you get the tzvi into your house, v'na'al b'fanav, and you close the door. אבל ציפור שהכניס לבית ונעל בפניו פטור. But right, if I go one step out, right, the bird is only considered trapped if it's in the migdal. But if the bird is in the house, if you've ever had a bird inside your house and you're trying to get it out, so you know, right, you know how difficult it is. It's not so simple. So there it still be patur. Because it can get out through the windows. It normally doesn't, and it just flies against the windows, and then you have to figure something out to do. But Vein can't say that. Or tzvi shechnizam nachutz lebivar. The same thing with the deer. If you brought it up from outside into the bivar, into this enclosure, you're going to try and get it. You're going to be running around for hours. Okay, so that's the same about the bivar. Look, now says the Gemara. Okay, that's Rabbi Yudav. Chachamim omrim tzipor lamigdal. So meaning regarding the bird, really, there's no machloket. That's it. That's considered its trapping. But tzvi. Right, Tzvi, Bach changed the slightly here. Labait v'lagina, he adds in labait, right? Tzvi, labait, lagina, lachatzer v'labivarin. Whether you have the tzvi in your house, or you have it in the gina, the chatzer, the bivar, in this enclosure, all of these are considered that it's trapped. That is according to Chachamim. Not Rabbi, but that's according to Chachamim. So at this point, so let's just see Rashi. He says, Chachamim omrim tzipor lamigdal, he tzedato kasher amalta. Exactly, Chachamim agree with Rabbi Yehuda that if you have the bird, only when it goes into this migdal, then it's considered trapped. Aval tzvi, ein tzarich, ad she'achnisenu labayit, but with a tzvi, I don't have to say only when it goes into the house that it's considered trapped. Also these areas, haveit seidah. Umatniti in diktani tzadin mina bivarim beyom tov. Our Mishnah that says that you can trap it, you can take it out from the bivarim, from the enclosure on Yom Tov. That is the opinion of Rabbanan. Rabbanani. The Amri Mishnah nichnas la bivar unitzod veomed. Ubraita Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so far so good, right? So this is what we said. We had our Mishnah. Our Mishnah spoke about Dagim. Let's leave Dagim. We're not talking about those now. And then it spoke about Chayav ve'ofot. Our Mishnah said that Sadin Chayav off mina bivarim. The Mishnah said that you can take the animals or the birds from the enclosure because they're already trapped, and this would not be trapping. Then came our Braita and said exactly the opposite. It said when it comes to Chayav off, ein sadim mehem, meaning you cannot now take them out of the bivarim. In other words, they are not yet considered trapped, and if you take it, they would be. So we said, well, regarding chaya, regarding an animal, this really is a machloka between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim. Is the deer that's inside the enclosure but not inside the house considered trapped? According to Rabbi Yehuda, no. According to Chachamim, yes. Fine. So we've now solved half the stira. The problem is we still have a stira regarding ofot, regarding the birds. And we saw there that the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Yehuda regarding birds, that it's only in a migdal, that in a bivar, they are not considered trapped. So how do we now explain? So we say, says the Gemara, we're now about what, more or less 8 lines down. Ela ofot kasha. Birds and birds, that's going to be a kasha. V'chitaima hanami lo kasha. So you'll say, okay, maybe it's not a kasha. Maybe the Mishnah and the Braita are talking about different things, right? Ha bevar mekureh, ha bevar sheino mekureh. Maybe one's talking about an enclosure that has a ceiling, and one's talking about one that doesn't have that has a roof, and one's talking about one that doesn't have a roof. V'bayit de kabibal mekureh dami ubein Rabbi Yehuda ubein Rabbanan tzipor lamigdal in a bayit lo. So we say no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work because if you're going to say that according to one, it's only because there's no roof, that's not considered a trap. But a bayit, a house, has a roof, right? And that's going to be similar. So a house is going to be similar to the biba mekoreh. And whether it's Rabbi Yehuda, whether it's Rabbi or Rabbanan, in a bayit, the bird is still not considered trapped. It's only when it goes to the migdal right? Tzipor lamigdal in, labait lo. So therefore we say, Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, hacha betzipor dulol askina, sheina mekabelet malut. Tatan dvei Rabbi Yishmael, lama nikra shma tzipor dulol, shedala kebayit kevesadeh. Okay, so he says, no, we have to explain that we're dealing with, in this case, we're dealing with a different type of bird. A specific type of bird, what's called a tzipor dulol. I mean, it's like a free bird, meaning even if it's in an area where it's enclosed, the bird acts like it's free, and therefore that's what we're talking about. In other words, that's where we would say that everybody would agree that inside a house it's not going to be considered trapped. But if we go back to our Mishnah, that may not be the case, and therefore there may still be a machloket. In any event, once we now have this, what we see is that the original teruts that we gave, it works for the animals, but it doesn't work for the birds. And therefore the Gemara is going to reevaluate and say, maybe actually we go back and it's not machloket Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim, maybe there's a different way to resolve it that's going to resolve everything. Okay, but we'll stop there for today, and we will pick it up tomorrow, B'ezrat Hashem.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.
All right. See you tomorrow. God bless. Thanks.